It's based on the Laffer Curve, and the Laffer Curve was developed by the supply-side economist Arthur Laffer to show the relationship between tax rates and the amount of tax revenue collected by the government. So the curve is used to illustrate Laffer's argument that sometimes cutting tax rates can actually be beneficial for the economy and increase total tax revenue for the government. Now, Arthur Laffer is a strong advocate of a free market, and he's often recommended to political figures in the benefits of low tax rates to fund growth. So he became influential after working and being part of Reaganomics. So in other words, he was part of the economics board for Ronald Reagan. He's offered advice to Bill Clinton and even Donald Trump. And within the UK, it's been known that the Tory party under David Cameron, as well as Margaret Thatcher, they've considered his arguments in some of their policies. So this is the Laffer Curve, and it's based on the economic idea that people will adjust their behaviour in the face of the incentives created by tax rates, especially income tax. So higher income tax rates, they may decrease the incentive to work and invest compared to lower rates. So if this effect is large enough, it means that some tax rates, any further increases in the rate will actually lead to a decrease in the total tax revenue. So for every type of tax, there's a threshold rate above which the incentive to produce more diminishes, therefore reducing the amount the government receives. So if we consider this arrow here, and we just look at the very basics of the Laffer curve, at this point, the tax rate is at 0. So what I mean by that is if you go to work, the income that you receive from your employer, you get to keep it all and you take your full salary home. Because obviously you're not paying any tax because the tax rate is at 0, the government isn't going to receive anything, so the tax revenue will be at 0 as well. If you consider this point, with the tax rate being at its highest point possible, then the argument is that people wouldn't want to work, because why would you work for free? If you're working and you're literally instead of a pay slip, you're taking home a tax bill and all of your income is being sent to the government, then there is absolutely zero incentive to work. So there'll be no tax revenue. So within this video, what we're going to be focusing on is the points between. So to begin with, if we look at the income effect, and the income effect is pretty much suggesting that if higher tax leads to lower wages, then a worker may feel the need to work longer hours to maintain this target level of income. And if we think about every individual has some target level of income, a target level of income that they aspire and they try to achieve. And the reason why they might want to achieve it is for just the comfortability of life and maybe paying for your leisure activities. So if we consider leisure to be a normal good, as incomes rise, we can obviously afford more of them, hence the incentive to work longer hours. So if that tax rate is obviously is costing you, but you still want to achieve that higher level or that target level of income, you're going to work longer. So therefore the income effect means that higher tax rates will get some workers to feel the need to work longer to reach this target level of income. So as we can see here. But when it hits that point which I've labelled T, that is the optimal level of a tax rate that workers are willing to work for. When it hits that point and the tax rate gets higher, then people lose they're disincentivized from working. They feel that almost that they are being, punished for working because of the rate of tax that they're having to pay and that burden of tax. So what we see is something that's known as the substitution effect. And the substitution effect pretty much says if there's a higher tax, it leads to lower wages than working. So working becomes relatively less attractive compared to leisure. So if you consider the marginal cost in working, that additional hour of work becomes less appealing if it's experiencing a higher burden of tax. So the substitution effect of higher tax is that workers will simply want to work less, or they may not want to work in the UK or whatever the country might be at all. So that might actually lead to people leaving the country to try and find other countries with better tax rates or more generous tax rates or tax rates where they don't feel like they're being punished. It might mean actually that those who are thinking of retiring and that they're at that point of retirement, it pushes them over to retirement because they're thinking, well, why am I working if for every hour I work I'm having to pay higher and higher tax rates? So what we see as I said before, it's a substitution effect. So if higher tax leads to lower wages, then work becomes relatively less attractive than leisure. The substitution effect of higher tax is that workers will just want to work less, because if they're not working, they can be enjoying the leisure and doing other things, or they'll go to a country again where they can work less, and they will still be getting a higher income than if they were in the country that we're talking about. So the Wall Street Journal, they looked into this and the Laffer Curve further in 2010 with regards to the UK. So in 2010, just before the Conservative Party won the election and David Cameron became Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, one of his final decisions that he made to try to, I suppose, fund reducing the budget deficit that they had experienced after the Great Recession, was increasing the highest tax rate. So it went from 40% to 50%. And what Gordon Brown pretty much argued was that we have to increase tax revenue, and therefore one of the best ways we can do this is by getting the very rich within the UK to kind of fund that. However, as the Wall Street Journal has said, and the quote there is, "A funny thing often happens on the way to soaking the rich. They don't stick around for the bath." So in other words, when that rate was at its highest, all of a sudden these millionaires try to avoid it. Now, how they try to avoid it, I'm not going to even speculate. They may have just simply moved abroad, or they may have found other ways. But the number of taxpayers declaring £1 million a year in income fell by more than 60%. So the total number of millionaires that were filing their tax returns plunged from 16,000 in 2009-10 to 6,000 in 2010. So the new tax was meant to raise about 2.5 billion more in revenue, but I'll show you in a second by the graph, it definitely didn't. So in 2009-2010, British millionaires contributed about £13.4 billion, or just under 9% of the total tax liability of all taxpayers. But when it was at 50%, that suddenly reduced. It suddenly shrunk, and it was actually yielded to 6.5 billion, or about 4.4%. Now, there could have been different reasons. For example, maybe in 2010-11 we started to see more of the actual effects of the Great Recession. We can't put it all down to this, but within this article, the Wall Street Journal definitely did. So as we can see in the graph, 2010-11 tax hike forecast and how much money the politicians expected, and then what they actually received. Now, as I said before with Arthur Laffer, he did become influential because of Ronald Reagan and the policies that they came up with on tax. And this is a very, very good example to talk about in terms of why he might have a point in terms of having low tax rates, and how that could potentially lead to higher tax revenue for the government. So I'm just going to quickly show you these figures. So the columns on the right shows how much income tax was collected from the rich in 1980, when the top rate was 70%. And then it also shows you how much was collected from the rich in 1988, when the top rate was actually 28%. So I've just highlighted it here in the red boxes. The IRS collected 5 times as much income tax from the rich when the tax rate was actually far lower, which again potentially contextually supports Arthur Laffer's point. Now, in most recent times, we've seen this debate, and one example being the Buffett tax that Obama wanted to bring in. Now, this saw a lot of debate in terms of the criticism of such a tax, with the Republican Party really scrutinising it and bringing up many of Arthur Laffer's points. In fact, Arthur Laffer even spoke out about this, suggesting that it could potentially cause more damage than good if it did come into place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 2 videos, one from Obama as to why he wanted to bring in the Buffett tax and what the Buffett tax actually was, and then the other one in terms of Arthur Laffer arguing against it.
They should be called out. They should have to defend that unfairness. Explain by somebody who's making $50 million a year in the financial markets should be paying 15% on their taxes, when a teacher making $50,000 a year is paying more than that, paying a higher rate. They ought to have to answer for that. And if they're pledged to keep that kind of unfairness in place, they should remember the last time I checked, the only pledge that really matters is the pledge we take to uphold the Constitution. Now, we're already hearing the usual defenders of these kinds of loopholes saying this is just class warfare. I reject the idea that asking a hedge fund manager to pay the same tax rate as a plumber or a teacher is class warfare. I think it's just the right thing to do. I believe the American middle class, who've been pressured relentlessly for decades, believe it's time that they were fought for as hard as the lobbyists and some lawmakers have fought to protect special treatment for billionaires and big corporations. Nobody wants to punish success in America.
Best way to get revenues is to have a growing economy. And I have yet to hear of an economy taxed into prosperity. It just doesn't make sense. If they just didn't do these tax increases and we let the prosperity come, we would have revenues pouring in. But no. They're going to tax this economy into a further decline, and you won't get the money.
Everything's not looking good next year, Art. Certainly not as good as they look this year. No. We had Ben Bernanke addressing, the possibility of a double dip. He didn't rule it out, but he didn't seem like it was likely. Are you saying that we're going to see a double dip recession if if we keep these tax rates up high here?
I think that's true. Yes, I do.
You do?
Yes, I do. I think we're going to have a double dip. And I wish we weren't, but, my analysis leads me to believe we will.
Coming because of the opposition from the Republican Party, but we can kind of see both points of view in terms of why Laffer was suggested it's not the best way to increase tax revenue, and also why Obama might have been doing it. I think it's also worth pointing out that there are many different reasons for tax, and actually it's not all just because of tax revenue, which perhaps Laffer suggests. We also have to remember one of the most important elements of a tax policy is redistribution of income and wealth. And I think this is what Obama was trying to get at when he wanted to bring in this tax policy, that perhaps inequality was getting greater and greater, especially after the Great Recession, and he wanted to try to reduce that.